Hi, hello, so it's Hal, welcome back to my channel. I just wanted to chat about all the books that I've read so far. Well, all the books that I read in October. I ended up reading 7 books in October, and there was, I think, a mixed bag of them. A lot of the books that I did end up reading are kind of sequels or continuations in the series, so for those I am mostly going to talk about kind of the synopsis of the first book in the series, and then where it's applicable I'll talk a little about kind of the plot, but I don't want to kind of spoil what's gone on in the kind of later books there, so obviously that's something to kind of take into account. The first book that I read in October was The Lost Future of Pepperharrow by Natasha Pulley. This is the sequel to The Watchmaker of Pulley Street, which I read last month. Or not last month. Was it the month before? A couple of months ago. I was, waiting around. I saw that it was available in my library, so I ended up picking it up. So it's kind of a historical kind of fantasy. It's set in the 1880s, and one of our characters, Nathaniel Steepleton, kind of starts off working for the Home Office. He then, kind of in the first book, he finds this like mysterious pocket watch in his house, and it ends up saving him from kind of this like Irish national kind of bombing, and so therefore kind of he ends up being forced by kind of his job to investigate a little bit more about the watchmaker who made this clock and if there's any connection there with kind of the bombings that's been going on. The watchmaker is Kamome, who is kind of our other main character in the series. He's kind of a Japanese immigrant who spends his time making watches in the kind of area. They end up kind of convoluted series of events moving in together, and so kind of they're the main two characters in the stories. The other main character is Grace Caro, who is a woman who is trying to kind of conclude her research kind of on physics, on the trying to research into ether, and then, but like obviously there's more tug and pull of this woman kind of trying to do physics research in Oxford in the 1880s, who's unmarried and stuff like that. All of their lives get kind of intertwined, and kind of the story kind of goes on from there. I had a really good time with this one. It is Natasha Pulley's kind of first book. I felt like it was really good, especially coming off kind of, it was the first book of hers I read after The Mars House, which I absolutely enjoyed, but it didn't kind of fully compel me. With The Lost Future of Pepperharrow, this is set about kind of 5 years later. Daniel is now kind of working as a translator, Kamome is still working kind of as a watchmaker, and they end up going to Japan, where there's reports of a bunch of ghosts kind of happening in all the buildings, and he's having to investigate it for kind of the Foreign Office and stuff like that. Mori has his own kind of things going on, and when we're there we also meet a new character called Takiko Pepperharrow, who has this kind of connection with Mori as well. And then kind of things devolve from there. There's obviously stuff going on with Mori that I'm not spoiling because it's a plot point in the kind of the first book as well. I really enjoyed kind of the story in this book. I loved all the characters. I felt like the tension that the ghosts kind of put to the story was really good, really kind of creepy, spooky ooky. And there was just like this growing dread throughout this book that something was going to go terribly wrong, and there was no way of kind of fixing it. Really good time. I love kind of Daniel and his relationship with Mori, and stuff like that. There was a passage at the end of this book that like absolutely made me like scream, cry. It took me out. I like screenshotted and sent it to a friend being like, I'm gonna kill myself now. So, that's what's going on with that one. This book has absolutely stuck with me. It then ended up did buying a copy of this book because it's just like moved me very deeply. So I am interested in, there is another book set in the same world, kind of I think in between that time period between the first and the second book, which is vaguely referenced in the second book, so I am interested in kind of picking that out, but I think it's got different characters and stuff like that. The next book that I finished in October was Maker's Curse by Trudi Canavan, which is the final book in the Millennium Rule series. It's kind of an high adult fantasy. This one I can't really talk about because there's a lot of stuff that happens in these 4 books. The setup of the first book is we're following kind of 2 characters and 2 POVs. We've got Tyne, who's a student at a magical university, who's studying kind of magic and archaeology. He's on this archaeological dig. He finds this weird book in a tomb, and he finds out that this book was previously a woman who'd been transformed into a book, and basically anytime anyone touches her, she can read and record all of kind of their knowledge. And so he kind of then goes into this, like, should he give this to the university? Should he keep it for himself? Like, is this a person kind of thing? And things kind of get a little bit out of hand for him. The other character that we follow is called Riel. She lives in a culture where, like, the magic is only really used by priests, and if anyone else who isn't a priest uses it, they're kind of seen as kind of sullied in some kind of way. She gets kidnapped by someone who is kind of illegally using this magic, and she ends up kind of escaping that, but meeting kind of a young artist as well, and her life kind of devolves from there, because, you know, her family are kind of new rich dyers, and they're wanting to marry her off to kind of someone, you know, with money and kind of status, and she's kind of actually more interested in kind of this artist guy kind of there. Obviously, after that, the world kind of really expands, things really evolve. We are such a different place in the 4th book than we were in the 1st book. I felt like their characters have really grown kind of over the series. Riel has very much become one of my favourite characters, where I wasn't as interested as much in her storyline kind of in that 1st book. I finished that, like, I really enjoyed the story. I think it concluded kind of really nicely. I did think that the final, like, villain kind of setup in this book happened, like, really late on. And I was like, okay, so we're doing this now, I guess. But, you know, I did think everything kind of wrapped up nicely and everything like that. I've had a blast. I think it has some really interesting ideas about kind of, you know, people's kind of what they want to do and how that actually impacts kind of the choices that they then have going forwards kind of thing. There's a pacific character, but it's hard, like, kind of, it's what I'm trying to say. I ended up giving that 4 stars. And then the next book that I ended up reading was The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. I know that this is a book that has had, like, mixed reviews and stuff like that, but yeah, so I ended up really enjoying this. This is kind of historical fantasy. It's set during the kind of 1500s Spanish age, kind of golden age, Inquisition kind of going on. And we follow kind of, our main character is Louisa, who is a Skillian maid who can perform kind of these, like, little miracles. So she can, like, unbreak a glass that's been broken, stuff like that, unburn kind of bread that's been burnt. This gets found out by the lady of her house, and she forces her kind of to start performing for guests, and then this eventually kind of leads to the Antonio Perez, who's the disgraced kind of advisor to King Philip II, finding out about her, and then he's basically looking for a miracle user, which is kind of what Louise is kind of presenting herself as, to kind of fight in, like, a magical war almost against the British. So basically the entire kind of household gets wrapped up in participating in this kind of scheme to win Antonio Perez's kind of favour, including a character called Guillian Santangel, who is the titular kind of familiar of the book. But we do follow a lot of characters in this, kind of here and there, and yeah, so everything kind of gets a little bit more complicated and stuff like that. So we're doing a lot of kind of, like, following her, kind of learning magic, a lot of politics. Another thing that gets tied in is that Louisa has Jewish ancestry. Her parents kind of were forcibly made to convert. And so that's kind of a big worry for her, especially when she's, like, trying not to get caught by the Inquisition, but still is, like, trying to present herself as doing these, like, Catholic kind of saintly miracles, where it's, you know, probably not, you know, that's not what she's actually using to kind of do this magic kind of thing. I think that was, like, really interesting, especially because seeing that it's set in Spain, we're leaning a lot more on the Sephardic kind of Jewish tradition, which is the other kind of big main Jewish tradition in Europe. other than kind of the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition. I thought that was a really interesting thing to learn about in this book. I had a really good time. This is one of the books where I ended and I was crying and I was just like holding my hand up like, thumbs up, this is great. I do think that having, read it, having had to think about it, the book that it really reminds me of actually is a book called The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. This one definitely has more kind of magic, fantasy lend to it, but with The Miniaturist, it's a similar kind of family, a lot of people, kind of historical drama with kind of a magical element as well. And I think the perspectives that are kind of, how the perspectives are set up in the familiar is, at least in my memory, is quite similar to how The Miniaturist kind of felt to me. And I think that could be why there have been, some mixed reviews, is that it's much more of like an historical fantasy with this kind of magical bent, rather than like a fantasy that is also historical, with using that as kind of my point of connection. But it really worked for me. I thought it was really fun. I had a great time. I really liked all the characters and the relationship in this. I felt like I was taken, for a ride kind of thing. The next book that I finished was Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. I read this kind of as an audiobook, which I think really added to the experience as well. So this book is kind of a non-fiction book. It's talking about the spate of kind of serious murders that happened to the Osage Nation in the 1920s, when they were kind of the richest population per capita in the US. They'd moved onto this kind of reservation and there was an oil kind of fields below it, basically. It's set into kind of 3 parts. The first part is kind of the history of the Osage people, how they got onto this territory and what was going on, and then it follows the murders surrounding kind of Molly Burkhart, who is kind of one of the central characters in kind of this story. The second part is about the FBI investigation led by Tom White, and it kind of explains what was happening in that investigation, all the twists and turns and stuff like that. Honestly, I finished this session being like, oh my god, like Tom White is such a decent guy for like this period of time. It was really, really cool and really interesting. And then the third part is a kind of current day, I believe David Grann talking about kind of him looking into these murders, going and visiting kind of the Osage people, how these murders still kind of affect the population today, and also uncovering some more of kind of these killings and solving some of them, but obviously you're limited in it being kind of, so much time later. I really liked how this was structured in those 3 acts. When I was listening to the audiobook, they had different narrators as well for those acts. I felt like it made it kind of, the information therefore was presented in this way that really linked everything together, but you kind of did have breaks in kind of how that information was presented. I just felt like that meant that I absorbed everything a lot more. I was just really invested in the story and wanting to know kind of what happened in the next part. I ended up giving this one as well 4 stars. The next book that I read was Shadowstitch by Cari Thomas. This is a sequel to Threadneedle, which I read kind of early in the year. I'd become actually interested in it because I saw Threadneedle being released and I thought it was a cool cover, and the synopsis was quite interesting as well. So it's a young adult kind of urban fantasy. We're following our main character Anna, who has been brought up by her aunt, who belongs to kind of a particular set of witches who are called binders, who don't really kind of use their magic and have bound it kind of away, and it's all kind of about knots and restrictions and stuff like that. And she's kind of going to undergo that binding ceremony kind of this year as well, when basically a couple of things happen. 7 like faceless women are found hanging from Big Ben, and as she's going to go into a new year of school, 2 more people kind of join her year, and that's Effie, who is the daughter of Celine, who's basically acted like as well as another kind of aunt figure to Anna her entire life, and then Attis, who is Effie's kind of best friend and kind of on-off boyfriend situation. So Anna kind of goes into, I think, her year of school, and she is kind of forcibly made to come out of her shell. She makes friends. She becomes kind of part of a coven of witches. They're trying to like deal with the bullies at the school and stuff like that, and things kind of, expand, get more complicated and stuff like that. I did enjoy the first book. I ended up giving it 3 stars, but it's very teenagers in an old girls' school in London, like private school in London, which, you know, is not my experience of going to high school. Let's just say that. And then with Shadowstitch, we're kind of facing the experiences of the consequences of that first book. There's been kind of this growing suspicion of magic users and stuff like that. There's a lot of growing dread and paranoia going on in this book, which I do think was done kind of really well. But the main issue that I had with this book is it just felt really long. It was only about 100 pages longer than the first book in this series, but it just dragged on, and there was just so much happening that, like, everything was kind of important, but also at the same time I didn't really care about anything that was happening, which was the issue. Like, I'm not opposed to large books. I'm currently reading Fire and Blood, which is long. It's a long book. It's a long, dense book, but I'm having a great time with that, so it's definitely, like, something in this book just didn't work for me. I also just... Unfortunately, some of the character development that was also occurring in this book just felt like it got wiped away at the end of this book. I think it's like one of those sequel problems of like the second book in a series where you're doing some character development and then you need to like almost reset things for the third book. That was kind of annoying. Especially because one of the characters who was undergoing some of that development was a character who I don't really enjoy. I didn't really like her in the first book, and I was like, oh, okay, we're actually getting some more interiority, some growth from her. And then it was just kind of all torn down in the like last couple of pages, and I was like, what am I even doing? Also, I just felt like, you know, I feel like at some point we were discussing that they were going into like their final year of sixth form, and anything regarding like applying to university was just not talked about, which is wild because especially because, again, like I mentioned, it's an all-girls private school in London. You know some of these girls are applying to Oxbridge, or like Anna's described wanting to apply to medicine beforehand. And both of those things are have an early application deadline in like October. You know? This book discusses Christmas, so I know that, like, if it is actually their final year of sixth form, that's gotta have been going on. Anyway, I don't actually remember if it's their final year of sixth form or not, but, like, at a certain point, I got really frustrated about this thing. This book ended up being just, like, fine. It was long. I was bored for a lot of it. I'm not sure if I'm going to continue this series. It's very much going to be, can I get this from the library and stuff like that? I did end up giving this 2 stars there. The next book I wanted to have a little quick read was the Witch Hat Atelier, kind of volume 12 by Kamome Shirahama. I've been reading this manga kind of on and off. I got up to kind of volume 11 and I knew that volume 12 was going to be coming out this year. For some reason, I was convinced that this was the last volume. It's not, but I'd just been like hanging on to it since it kind of had come out. But yeah, so I ended up reading it because I was like, well, this is kind of going to be a quick read for me. I can slot it in here. It's following our main character, Coco, who basically, she's a young girl. She's always dreamed about kind of becoming a witch, but because she wasn't born with magical powers, she believes that she can't kind of do that. However, through a series of, weird and magical incidents, she ends up finding out that, that it's not actually true. She can do magic. She accidentally turns her mother to stone, normal things. And then she gets accepted into an atelier to learn magic instead of her memory kind of being wiped, with the ultimate goal, I think, her kind of completing her magical kind of learning and being able to reverse kind of what happened to her mother. There's a lot of stuff going on in this story. There's a lot of kind of different factions of witches and stuff like that. It's really fun. I love all the characters in it. There's a lot of kind of young girls supporting each other, growing better, getting better, and stuff like that, learning from your mistakes, being brave, all of those classic kind of shoujo kind of things going on. This was where we're at with the kind of story. the king kind of has turned up. There's a big procession for kind of Silver Night Eve where a bunch of the witches show off kind of new inventions and stuff like that. And there's just been kind of like, there's a big fight in kind of this volume against kind of someone that turns up. It was really fun. We're getting more lore. We're getting fights. The art style continues to slap. There's an incredibly funny little cutaway where a terrible young little witch child has cursed, in the last volume, cursed one of the like magic police witches to lose his memory. And his like boyfriend is like, basically at some point he's like, oh, I wanted to like join us together in some other way, but like whilst we're still trying to get your magic back so that you're still allowed to be in this place, will you be my apprentice? And then and then they also end up kind of pseudo looking after the terrible little witch girl who cursed the guy to lose his memory. So that I'm sure that's gonna be a slapstick routine. But yeah, like, I had a really good time. Every time I read a new volume, I have a good time. I'm now just going to be, like, anxiously waiting for the next volume to come out because, I mean, to be fair, I was getting to the end of it and I was like, we are not wrapping this story up. I should have expected that. But yeah, good time. I ended up giving this one kind of 4 stars as well. And then the last book that I ended up finishing in October was Angel Mage by Garth Nix. This was the first Garth Nix book that I'd read that wasn't one of his, like, Sariel, like, a Boston, like, Old Kingdom series of books. And turns out that it's, you know, still a lot of fun, still good. So this is it's a young adult novel, it's set in a fantasy world, it's kind of very heavily inspired by kind of Musketeers and that kind of time in France. Just with like the Musketeers, the Cardinals, Pursuivants, stuff like that going on. But we are kind of very much in a fantasy realm. The main 2 countries that we focus on are a country called Sarans and a country called Istara, so like definitely nothing to do with, you know, Earth. And the other thing is that basically people can draw upon these icons of these angels and they will do kind of magical powers. Each angel, there's kind of more powerful angels and they all have different kind of areas of kind of power. So one angel can do healing, stuff like that. And yeah, the other main change in this world is that it's a lot more kind of queer normative and kind of less racist. There's more black and brown characters going on in here. We follow kind of 5 characters. One of them is Lilieth, who is a very powerful kind of angel magic user. She's been chilling in a sarcophagus for 100 years, don't worry about it. And she's kind of got this big plan to reunite with her angel lover, Perennial, who's like also been missing for about 100 years. And she's our main driving force kind of plot-wise. The other 4 characters are a series of kind of 4 young friends who find each other and are kind of inexplicably drawn together. So that is Simeon, who is a medical student, Henry, who's kind of a young clerk who really wants to become an artilleryman, but his parents didn't have the money for it, basically. Agnes, who is a very kind of new musketeer cadet, and Dorothea, who's an icon maker and kind of a scholar of angelic magic. They all kind of meet together, they begin to kind of form this friendship, and they get tangled up in this plan that Lilieth kind of has, because they're quite integral to it. This was a really fun time. I really liked the world, I really liked the kind of world building, the magic system with all the angels. I love a trinket-based, relic-based magic system, and in general, relic-based religion-y stuff is I really find it interesting. I find it fun. It was just a really fun, good time. It is very much a young adult novel. There's a certain point, so part of the magic system is that when you draw upon these angels, you do exchange some of your life force. So, not with our main cast of characters, but with some other characters, they look a lot older than they actually kind of are. And there's this point where they're talking about one of the, the Cardinal's main, Cardinal's main Pursuivant, who's a lady called Rochefort, and they're like, oh my god, I think Agnes is she's 27, that's still so old, and I'm like, you are so 19 years old. you have no idea what's gonna happen to you. But like, I think that's appropriate for the genre that it's, you know, playing at. They're all kind of 19-year-olds, more or less, the main kind of four. That's kind of part of the point. But yeah, I had a really fun time with that. I also ended up giving that kind of 4 stars. So at the moment I am, like I mentioned before, I'm reading Fire and Blood by J.R.R. Martin, which I'm having a really good time with. It's the book that kind of inspired the House of the Dragon series. Not that I watched any of these. And then I'm also listening to Crypt by Professor Alice Roberts, which is more kind of non-fiction about burials, life and death in the Middle Ages. I've got to read a book about death at least once a year. It's got to be a part of it. But yeah, that's kind of everything that's been going on. What I might do as well is just film another video where I talk about some books that I ended up getting this month, just because this is getting a bit long. That's everything that I've been reading. I hope that you've also been reading some nice things, and I hope that you have a nice day.